I mean, there's like no messaging. It's like they say a prescribed burn is going on today. Don't call us because there's smoke in the air. That's about all the messaging. Like, okay, maybe it's an opportunity to do really cool science shit. Like, that would be awesome. I don't know, like versus JPL, I get messages about discovering the universe. I mean, I could go up to Mount Wilson and do all these tours of this really wonderful stuff that's all about this like amazing, you know, the literal discovery of the universe or whatever. And like that kind of thing is really cool. Like it's like a trip out to go do that. And I know Harold Biswell back in the 50s or whatever used to bring people out and do burns like in front of them on a small scale. And I think it seemed to have changed minds as he did that. And so like, I would have loved growing up in California as like a California school kid to go out and get to watch a little bit of a bird. Like, you know, that would have been so cool. And it would have changed my perspective on it.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode is all about fire, but it's a little bit different this time. It's more of a living with fire, more of a how do we thrive with fire? How do we feel about fire? This kind of stuff. And it was a really, really interesting conversation for me. I got to speak to science writer and journalist Jacob Margolis, who has created a show called The Big Burn, and it's from LAist Studios, and it's a really interesting show. It's a deep dive into personal stories that illuminate the history of how we got here, why we keep screwing things up, and what we can do to survive and maybe even thrive while the world around us burns. At least that's what it says on the on the podcast show. And it's a really interesting podcast that starts at the beginning of, you know, how did we get here? How do we feel about this? How do we learn to live with this? They call it a bit of a survival guide. So there's a few episodes where it gives some pretty awesome, you know, tips and tricks and ways to prepare yourself for these eventualities. And speaking to Jacob was awesome because he's someone who went into this investigation into wildfire as a journalist, someone who doesn't have expertise in fire. And he learned about it along the way and created this show that I think really helps people follow along. Like you could give this show to anybody and they could start to understand fire and how we got here. And it's based in California, so he talks a lot about California, but realistically, these concepts they're good for pretty much anywhere that is in this situation of more severe and intense fire. So, a great show. I really got to dive deep into Jacob, into his motivations and his inspirations for doing this. And I wanted to talk to him a lot about science reporting and science writing and where we think we're getting the message wrong with wildfire and how come the public isn't able to digest this in a way that we hope to be able to do, right? So yeah, it was a great episode. I can't wait to share it with you. Sponsors. We have 2 sponsors for 2022. West Fraser is the number one, and without them, this would not be possible. So thank you, West Fraser, for your support this year, and can't wait to do it again next year. And Greenlink Forestry is the other sponsor. Without them, again, wouldn't be possible. Been with me since the beginning, and I can't thank them enough. Thank you, Greenlink. And yeah, this is the last one for 2022. Next year, we're going to do things a little bit differently. I usually do release an episode every 3 weeks. Going forward, it's going to be once a month. That's all I got the energy, time, and ability to mentally cope with. So that's what's going to be. I think the third Wednesday of every month it's going to be. So starting in January, that's what it'll be. And I hope to bring you, more interesting, more learned, more fascinating content with that different schedule. So thank you very much for listening for 2022. And without any other messing around, here is Jacob Margolis on his podcast, The Big Burn, and what he learned during his investigation. Here we go. Yeah, you're a science journalist, and you don't really have the background in specifically in fire, environmental management, that kind of thing. So I wanted to know why this topic, why such a deep dive? How did this get on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, I love being a science journalist because I get to really dive deep into things that I find to be very interesting. And so before fire, I covered space, space exploration, which was really fun, not nearly as depressing as climate change, which I shifted to. I covered earthquakes, and I generally tend towards disasters at this point, and climate change. And so with fire, I mean, it was really that in 2017, everything started to kind of shift here in California. And the fire experts will say 2015. I say for the general public and for people like myself, 2017, because that's when we really saw what happened in the Tubbs fire in Northern California, where, entire neighborhoods were burned down. And this was a violent, destructive, deadly fire. And then right after that, in LA, we got hit by the Thomas fire, and the Thomas fire became the biggest fire on record for California, and it burned into January. And I looked back at some articles that I wrote around that time, and I was very focused on earthquakes at that point. But one of my articles, upon returning to kind of science reporting in the newsroom, was a conversation with a very well-known climate scientist, Daniel Swain, out of UCLA. And I was asking him, is this normal? And so from that point, I've spent a lot of time just trying to unpack the context for a lot of the really scary stuff that we're facing. And my ultimate hope, I'm driven by my own personal interest and why we keep getting inundated with smoke again and again and again, with also I would really like to help people. And in my opinion, knowledge about this stuff, it makes it a little less scary. Some things like climate change, it makes it even more scary in some ways because you see how intensely bad things look. But when it comes to fires, once you start to understand the nuance, you're there's good fire out there. Oh, okay. There's this kind of weather begets this kind of fire, and I can kind of plan for this. And I think that knowledge is power. And that's kind of what drives me at this point also. So it's both of those things, personal interests and hopefully helping people. I hope people get helped.
We all hope that, right? We hope what we put out there in the world is helpful and gives somebody a hand for sure. So I think, like I mentioned prior to recording here, I think the main reason I was attracted to this conversation was, well, first of all, the storytelling you did in your podcast, The Big Burn, was, the storytelling and science journalism that you did in there was impeccable. Like I said, I'm always looking for, where journalists are missing something in the science when we're doing this kind of stuff, just because it's not their expertise and it's not their fault. They're not doing it on purpose, but you can't always catch everything. And sometimes that can lead to misinterpretations of things. But I never found any of that in all 10 episodes. And, so I was really, really happy to see that. And what I wanted to talk to you about is, your journey through this and then science communication and that kind of thing. So I think I want to know a little bit about, if you think back, can you paint a picture of your concept of fire pre this investigation? And maybe how you think that started to, or I'm sure it's changed a lot, obviously, but I want to kind of know what it was going into it and how, and what triggered the change.
Mostly being terrified, mostly being anxious about it. I would say my main feeling about fire prior to this show was one of just being kind of scared and being upset by it. And I can give some sort of context for that. And it's because I live in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley and, here in Southern California. And I grew up here, and fires and smoke were never this bad. And what happened was, I have little kids, and I know how bad, because I've talked to people about the studies behind the impact of wildfire smoke on health. I know how bad it can be for little babies, especially in little kids and really older people, all of us. And we just could not keep the smoke year after year, could not keep the smoke out of our house. And I had this moment during the pandemic in 2020 in the fall, where I'm sitting in my house and it's hot. And September here, it's 100+ degrees. And we've got all this smoke coming in the house from like the Bobcat fire, which was burning over near like Griffith Park. I think this was September. I think it was that fire. I'm sorry if I'm conflating some different fires. There's been a lot of them. But I just remember sitting in my living room and being like completely despondent. Like, I can't keep my kids safe. I feel really sick from breathing in smoke for all this time. A lot of us do. And then all of a sudden it would be like the next fire comes and the next fire comes. And even if the one near you gets put out, then there's one in Northern California that's sending smoke down here because smoke can travel thousands of miles. And so that was kind of all my context for fire prior to this show. And I still have those feelings of discomfort. But since then, a couple things have happened. One is that I have prepared appropriately. So I've spent time weatherizing my home. I've spent time, which sounds silly to people that live around like with snow and stuff, but here, like there's no weather, right? We never rains. It doesn't snow. It's like, so it's just wind and heat. And so I spent time weatherizing my home. I bought a lot of air purifiers and like that started to empower me a bit and make me feel like, okay, even if it's smoky outside, I know we'll be okay. And here my kids will be safe. And like at the very least we have that.
Right.
And then when I started the project, I really wanted to understand, is it as bad as I feel it is? And what are the different pieces of this big puzzle? Like, how can we start to approach this to kind of improve the problem? And where are we failing to improve the problem? And so I really, it comes, I think a lot of stories for journalists come from your own personal desire to figure something out. And this is such a big problem and such a big issue that impacts so many people around the world. And it's only getting worse in a lot of spots. That I also knew it would be a good story. So when I got to dive into it, I was taken aback again by how much nuance there was, by the different understandings and experiences with fire. And it gave me hope in some ways. It left me more despondent in others. But I feel more comfortable now than I did prior to doing this show.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, that's good. That's good. Yeah. And that's kind of what I was looking for, right? Is, that's kind of the gist that I get from people, especially in California, where it is, like, you do have so much fire, right? Alberta, BC, Canada, we have a lot of fire, but they tend to be kind of one and done, for a bit, right? Cause there's kind of big crown
it's never
fires.
One and done here.
Yeah. Well, you guys, it's just a totally different climate, right? And so it's so I wanted to know from a public perspective, what are people's feelings from a place like California, where it's just everybody's talking about it right now, right? And like we're talking about it in Alberta, in Canada, but I feel like it's so regular in California that the mindsets must be different. There must be a lot more fear, a lot more terror, a lot more what happens, especially when, annually you have communities burning, right? And we're having that in Canada as well, but I don't think not to the degree and to the extent that really California is getting it on a regular basis. And so I wanted to know, it's interesting to hear you say that in some ways you were feeling a little more doom, but also feeling a little more clear. And I think that's what brought me to this idea, this story, right? Is that I'm trying to paint a picture in people's minds of how should they feel about fire, right? Because I think you're right. It is this balance.
Yeah. So I think it would help listeners, especially if I gave some sort of context for like the environment here and where we live, where I live down here, especially.
Yep.
Our fire season, pretty much regardless of climate change, just like California dries out, come August, September, especially where I live in Southern California. And the Santa Ana winds, which are these really strong winds that flow from the east out towards the ocean, start in late September, early October. We just basically have to hold on until either the Santa Ana winds come to an end, which doesn't happen until April, or we get some rain. And so fire season has generally historically been kind of like September for us here until kind of like November, maybe early December.
Okay.
Now, because it's been so dry and those winds still keep coming, we're having fires burn into January, February, March. And the thing about the Santa Ana winds is that they're unbelievably strong a lot of the time. and they push fire really, really, really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so here where I live in Southern California in the San Fernando Valley, it's a giant bowl. And these winds will just slam into basically the rim of that bowl. And a couple of years ago, for instance, we had the Woolsey fire, which started out in Chatsworth, which for those of you who have ever watched old Star Trek movies or Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino, where they had some of those like ranch shots and stuff, that's kind of like out in the Chatsworth area. It's very dry, kind of chaparral, deserty kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, a fire starts there, and all of a sudden you have the Santa Ana winds. That thing's going to tear all the way along the rim of this valley that is home to I think it's over 1 million people. It might be millions of people, and keep going. And when those winds show up and that fire gets going, any community between the start of the fire and whatever the end is likely to burn. Firefighters can't stop it as long as those winds are there. And so for us here, we just know as soon as, if you're paying attention, you know as soon as those winds start and it's dry and wind and rain hasn't shown up, that we could see, like we did with the Woolsey fire a few years ago, it burned from Chatsworth all the way down. It didn't stop till it hit the ocean. And that's really, really scary. Yeah. And so I think that there's this feeling, very much this feeling of like those fires can happen anytime during this period of year, this period of the year. Yeah. And most people don't prepare, I would say, but you know, people rebuild in the same place, and that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, it's kind of, it's why, so that's sort of why it's very present in our minds, I would say. But it's gotten especially bad the past few years. What I would say since 2017, when the Thomas fire hit, biggest fire in California history at the time, quickly usurped by many other fires that followed it. But it just began like, we had a lot of years of like not fires like that that would only come along once in a while. And now it feels like they hit all the time. And just a few years ago, we had one like right along the hills out my window. And that, I mean, we were inundated. Our house wasn't going to burn down, but we were inundated with smoke for weeks and weeks, it felt like. And that's really hard to live through too.
Yeah, no, I think I think that was good because I'm trying to paint a picture of what's going on down there and what kind of motivated you to tell this story, right? Yeah. And because the questions I want to get to are stuff around like science communication and storytelling in science, right? Because I think that's one where like scientists and researchers, they shy away from telling the story, right? They stick to the facts because they don't want to water down the facts. They don't want to water down the research. They want to stick to not being misunderstood, right? But that makes for a boring story. And nobody reads that, right?
I will say it depends. Like, the thing is, unless you have kind of a beginning, a middle, and end, unless you have some sort of really heavy stakes, like people are just generally not going to kind of stick with you for 10 episodes. And that was a discussion for every single one of the episodes we did. So in episode 2, we talk about fires threatening giant sequoias. And in my mind, it was absolutely enough of a hook to say, look, we stand to lose all of these forests that we have come to love, including these giant sequoias. They will be type converted into other things. They will not recover. We will not have them, whatever, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I work with colleagues who are not in the science space, not in the fire space, climate space, who said, that doesn't really do it for me. And so we really had to work on, and it was a lot of negotiation back and forth and floating different ideas. What is that thing that is going to hook that person that hasn't been to a redwood, who hasn't been to visit a giant sequoia, who doesn't really love the mountains, who doesn't really care about nature. I had people tell me like, I don't really care about trees. That to me is like unfathomable personally. Right. I'm like, I care about a lot of this stuff and find it really interesting. But for a lot of people, they don't. And so you have to meet people where they're at. And what you'll hear in a lot of the episodes is this move towards telling my own personal story or the personal stories of other people. And what that lets you do in a narrative kind of context is it gives people something to latch on to, not kind of bigger ideas about what is nature and like saving nature and stuff like that. And it's just easier for a lot of people to process, myself included. You know, if it's a topic I don't care about, I kind of want to know what makes it, what's going to keep me around. And that's something that we constantly constantly asked and debated and had a tough time with. And I think every storyteller probably does. However, there are some stories that drop into your lap. And when it does, you're like, oh God, thank you. And you're like, I know exactly what the lead is. I know exactly where we're going with this. And also it's going to help us tell the story in a really important way that will result in some sort of big takeaway, which is always really nice. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think that was kind of the point I wanted to get to. And I appreciate you getting there so quickly, because that's the point, I think, is that people know that like fires are dangerous and climate change is kind of making things worse, and that there's more people in the landscape that's making things worse, but they don't know where to go from there. They're kind of lost with that information.
I don't know where to go from there. I got to be honest. Like, that's what this whole podcast was. Like, I don't know where to go from this place of just fear. And like, I don't think a lot of people really do.
Right. But I think with the show though, you managed to tell that story in a very clear, concise way. It showed a lot of appreciation for the nuance, for the work that does go in, for the amount of, understanding you have to, light a prescribed burn and have that go well, or a cultural burn for that matter. And so I felt when I was listening to it, it brought in a lot of, appreciation and respect for the people doing the work. But also it did paint a great picture of how big of a problem this is, and how truly all encompassing it is. And it's true. I think it's true pretty much globally, anywhere where there's lots of fire in the landscape. And so the point of telling this story with science, I think, is important, right?
Well, so you mentioned prescribed burning, and we really get at it across a series of episodes. And initially in episode 2, it was especially, you have to consider you're introducing people even to the idea of like good fire, which if I'm talking to a scientist, I'm not going to say good fire, because I understand it's not like, you're not putting, fire's not binary. It's, all that kind of stuff. But we need to bring it to a place where, like, in a normal conversation with a normal, not scientisty person, I would say good fire, bad fire at a party or whatever.
Yes.
The thing that you'll hear in episode 4 in particular, which is when I go out on a prescribed burn, that was the easiest episode to write, because there was action. There were really phenomenal people who explained stuff really clearly. If you could feel the stakes, you could just feel all of this. You could feel my own personal journey, which was very genuine through that whole thing. It essentially wrote itself. And there was just it was very clear what the through line was going to be. And I think that the reason I bring that up is because it made it easier for people to grab onto, relate to, listen to. And what I heard from a lot of people after the episode aired is that, like, why aren't we doing more of this? And that was kind of the point of it, right? That was the point of, like, okay, well, why aren't we getting to a point where if this isn't a big scary thing, then why aren't we doing this more often in more places? And of course, it's supremely complicated, and we didn't answer that in that episode. It was the next one a little bit, But it's it also helps when you have like really, really good people willing to chat with you, and I very much had very, very good people willing to chat with me.
Good people are key, absolutely, no, without a doubt. And I think that paints a good picture. I think I kind of want to paint a picture. We should talk about quickly, just so we can have the rest of this conversation about. I'll let you do it. I've done it quite a few times in this podcast, so don't feel you need to go into too much depth, but just a general overview of the situation we're in, right? Because some people may not understand why are we in this situation where there is more fire in the landscape? Why is the fire that exists now more dangerous, harder to control? How did we get here?
Yeah, so it's a really like heart-wrenching history, actually, and I would say that you can look at tree ring records and see that lots of fuel buildup began in our forests, like around the mid-1800s or so. And that's when the gold rush happened. It's when native people who had been actively managing the landscape in really complex ways for a really long time, who understood the landscape like next level, and integrated it into daily life, spiritual practice, all this kind of stuff. And I cannot speak for them. This is only what, obviously. Yeah. And I think that we should have all of those folks, especially from California, on, who are really good talkers on all this. But basically what you had after was genocide following the gold rush, or during and following the gold rush. And so you had the exclusion of fire on land across, especially in the forests here in California. And what you saw by the late 1800s was a buildup of fuel. And there were these letters coming in from people in places like Yosemite. I think it was like cavalrymen or people that were managing the land at the time that were like, hey, we used to be able to walk through these areas. The brush used to be clear. Now it's not. We can't really even pass through it. Like the Native Americans were doing burning. They were burning. They were pulling up shrub. They were doing their stuff. And now it's starting to look completely different. And there were people that were sounding the alarm at the time about fuel buildup and fire potential as well. Mm-hmm. And for a whole host of reasons, and we don't have to go into it, but basically what it was called the light burning debate lost out by like the mid 1920s or so. Mm-hmm. And it's a really, it's very much worth having someone on that's specifically an expert in that time period, because it's a really, and we didn't even get into it really deep in the podcast. I think it's a really interesting discussion around like why we ultimately chose to pursue this, what is essentially just fire suppression for the past 100 plus years, right?
Yeah.
And you get into really interesting discussions about the science of it and all that, like people just pushing for certain science, as well as the financial motivations and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, by the 1960s or 70s, because we had built up this fire suppression apparatus that had been putting out fires all over the place in the forests, especially in Northern California, you just had a ton of fuel buildup, and it was just priming everything to burn down the line. They started to notice that, and really, Harold Biswell, I don't know if you've talked about him at all in the show, but like
no.
Harold Biswell and and other academics started to talk about it, and were like, hey, we should probably go out and do this. And there was a slow adoption of the idea of doing prescribed burning. But then it remained in like the national parks, but it never really took off in other places, like with CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service, I would argue. And so basically, then you had climate change come along and heat everything up, and all of a sudden you have all this fuel, and you have climate change that's also desiccating a lot of these landscapes and a lot of these trees, and you have a lot of stuff ready to burn. I mean, that's the case in a lot of the forests here. And so now it's burning with such intensity, it's wiping everything clear, and you get high severity fire, which I'm sure you've talked about ad nauseum in the show at different times. Here in Southern California, it's different. And it's not just Southern California, it's like chaparral. And chaparral ecosystems in particular, and coastal sage scrub ecosystems here, it is different. Fire exclusion has been an issue. However, we have too much fire on a lot of these landscapes here. And and so what a scientist named John Keeley, who's a well-known guy with USGS, US Geological Survey, has found, along with a lot of other folks, is that basically the fire return interval in a lot of these places for the chaparral, like in this area where I live, for some of these plants would be like 20 to 50 to 100 years, right? The typical, that would allow them to recover, to build up their seed banks, all that kind of stuff. They're getting hit with fire every like 5 years, 10 years, and it's just wiping out seed banks. And so you're getting type conversion here as well. I mean, if you look out the hills out my window that got hit repeatedly, it's just grasses now. It used to be chaparral and stuff, and now it's just grasses. And so there's a variety of different reasons depending on where you are in the state. And I think that was a big thing that I wanted to get at in this podcast, is that like we clearly need a complete overhaul of how we handle fire in forested ecosystems, especially here in the state of California. But when it comes to Southern California, the way we've chosen to build and how we choose to use the land and like what our ideals are, as far as I can tell, the fire suppression apparatus is really what people want and what we would need to maintain our current state of things here.
Pretty much all the exact same things that you talked about for California happen in the rest of North America as well, right?
Yeah.
It started with the genocide of indigenous folks in North America, which they were doing, quote unquote, good fire on the landscape. So you removed that fire. And then, with industry and agriculture and settlement comes fire suppression. And then with fire suppression comes more fuel buildup, and then climate change adds to that more opportunity for fire, longer fire seasons, hotter, drier winds, and you just have this perfect, powder keg. And that's true, I think, of most of North America now.
But it also wasn't just good fire with Native Americans or indigenous people in different places. It was a completely different focus on what the landscape should be used for and how, or the relationship with the landscape. And that's something that I would have liked to have gotten into more in the podcast, and we signaled it in a couple places. But I feel like that's worth examining, and our land use policies are worth examining in the face of all this as well. And we get at it a little bit at the end of episode 5 in my discussion with Frank Lake, who is I believe he's with USDA. And I think that is a bigger discussion that we need to be having, which are, what is the land for and how do we treat it? And is brute forcing our way to this, maintaining whatever we think this ideal is that going to be the way? Is that really the way forward? Or do we need to make major considerations as to how we treat not just forested landscapes, but also, chaparral ecosystems and whatnot here?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and funnily enough, I've actually spoken with Frank Lake before on the Good Fire podcast that I mentioned to you earlier, that I did with Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. And,
nice.
And we talked about some of that stuff, I think it's interesting to point out that it's the same things across all of North America, right? And that these are all, so it's the same concepts, and it's applied differently, right, to every location, but it's the same concepts going on. And so it's pretty much applicable to anywhere you are. So this concept of fire suppression, and you talked a lot about, CAL FIRE specifically, being in California, and how it's a fire suppression agency, right? And that's what it was built for, and it does its job well. And with the recognition now in the last, I don't know how many years, how many decades, but the recognition of the fact that fire suppression has been a contributor to the situation that we're in now, which is, more dangerous fires. What, in your investigation, what did you feel was the response of agencies like CAL FIRE to that information, right? Obviously, they've probably been sitting with this information for a while, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with it. Cause it's not like it's a simple, I'm sure they recognize it. I'm not saying that they're neglecting it or anything like that. I just want to know where you felt their head was at when you talk to those people, when that information comes up, and where they're going with that information.
Well, I think it really came about in the 60s and 70s, the discussion about all of this. And CAL FIRE, which I can speak to in particular, we talked to the former chief of CAL FIRE, Ken Pimlott, who I can't remember his exact years, but I think it was like 2008 or 10 until like 15 or 17 or something.
Okay.
Anyway, when we talked to him, basically he said that CAL FIRE had a vegetation treatment program, did some burning in like the 80s into 90s, and then it just kind of fell to the wayside. And I think the overwhelming feeling that I just generally get talking to people kind of in this world is that a lot of it is, some of it's money, a lot of it's, I don't think anybody wants to do any harm, but I also think you have a direct result. Fire is burning, you put it out, it looks good. And I think it is good in a lot of cases when you save lives or you save homes or whatever. And so that is a very easy thing to also like quantify, right? As a performance metric. I think it gets really complicated when you start to, look at kind of the value of prescribed fire or good fire back on the land, or letting certain fires burn or whatever. And my understanding is the way that Ken framed it, and this is in episode 5, he talks about it, saying basically when he came in, it wasn't even on their radar. Like they were dealing with budget cuts after 2008. He's like, we were just trying to keep the lights on at that point. And it wasn't until a couple of chance meetings with some different folks, like different Native American leaders, different scientists. They're basically saying, hey, we're like sitting on a powder keg here. We want to go do this burning, but you're making it like difficult for us to do it. He kind of knew, he said he kind of knew things had to change, and thus began this kind of like, he says it's like turning an aircraft carrier, and I believe it. I mean, when you have an agency that's been doing one thing particularly, I think, well in a lot of cases, right, and like has built up this military level force to do this one big thing in particular, it's hard to start to integrate something that's hard to quantify. And I think it's gotten so bad now that everybody's looking for any kind of answer. And now all of a sudden it's like, now you're sitting down with the Frank Lakes, you're sitting down with the Bill Trips, and you're like, okay, please like help us figure this out. And, what I heard was a lot of resentment from the Frank Lakes and the Bill Trips, a lot of frustration because they've been talking about this for a long time, obviously. But it does seem that there is a bigger, I want to hope, and it does seem that there is a bigger cultural shift towards getting it done more often. However, we have not seen the acres. The acres are not being done the level they need to be done.
Yeah.
And so, remains to be seen what's going to happen, because I also know it does take a while to kind of shift things. But regardless, things are going to burn. I mean, they'll burn either way, right?
Yeah.
It's just
either starts in a way that's controlled, that what the ramifications are, what the forces are, or it starts from someone flicking a cigarette or a lightning strike or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to happen.
No, it's true. Yeah. And so that's interesting. I think that's similar again across North America, right? Like I think, I know here in Canada, there's been a lot of discussion, right? About, okay, how do we start doing more prescribed fire? How do we start doing more mechanical thinning and mechanical prep to try and, around communities and do fire smart or firewise in the States, right? And, but again, because it's fire, because it's a destructive force at times, there's always that fear, right? And there's always that, and it's again, like you said,
things can go wrong. Like it's worth acknowledging things can absolutely go wrong. They rarely do, but they can. And we don't have a robust enough system, at least here in California, to help take care of it when it does go wrong. And for us to then say, okay, we understand it went wrong. We need to continue this as a big part of the mission. Let's keep moving forward. We don't have that yet. I think people are building it. Yeah. But we don't have it yet.
And that was kind of what I was getting at. I was wondering where their heads are at. If there's if there is an acknowledgement of, okay, we need to keep suppressing fires because it's kind of at a point where you can't just let it go, right? But
it depends where, but yeah.
Yeah, like in certain places, like obviously around communities and that. But my point is, we need to start adding more tools to the toolbox, like doing more prescribed fire, like doing more mechanical prep, like doing more active engagement in the landscape, pre-ignition kind of thing, right? And so, and I think I wanted to know where, if there's a true actual acknowledgement of that and action being taken on that, or if it's still just words, if we're still just kind of just discussing it.
I mean, this is something that we try to figure out when we're writing pieces too, right? It's like, I don't think you have like an evil person sitting at the top of a tower, like twiddling their fingers or whatever. But I do think I think there is a serious consideration. At the very least, there is serious consideration of the change, and there is more money being put towards it. However, you talk to the advocates on the ground, and and this happens a lot, especially with advocates who have been talking about it for a while. They want things to move a lot faster, and we'll tell you the exact reasons why it's not. Yeah. And so I do think, I don't think we have a choice. I think the shift is occurring, but I am quite curious to see at what scale and by on what timetable it is able to occur.
Yeah. And that's the same thoughts that I hear from folks, right? Yeah. Especially from people in indigenous community that, fire practitioners and that stuff. Like it's just like you said, of Ken, I think it was, you said like moving an aircraft carrier, those big fire suppression agencies, it's no matter how much your intention is to move that thing, it's slow going. And cause you got to change the system. It's a systematic change. It's not just hearts and minds. You actually have to change policy and change, laws and that kind of stuff to move those things in the right direction. And
there does seem to be genuine interest.
Yeah. And that's what I've gathered as well. And again, I wasn't trying to point fingers at agencies or anything. It was more talking about the cultural shift of a society, right? And how slow that shift might be and how difficult it is to change. And
well, one of the interesting things that I heard now that you bring that up also with cultural shift is like, you have to also look at like the incentives for firefighters. And I'd want to hear more from firefighters around this, because I had heard stuff like anecdotally, but I think it'd be really interesting to see, they don't necessarily make overtime on burns, doing prescribed burning shouldn't be all that exciting in the same way that fighting a fire is. Like fighting a fire is pretty exciting in a lot of ways.
Yep.
And so I think you also need to look at the incentives for the people that go ahead and do that. One, you need to look at the incentives, and two, like for CAL FIRE in particular, they generally have a limited staff that is like supposed to be dedicated to like fuels management.
Right.
But that fuels management team gets pulled out to fight fire. And now all these people are fighting fire for 11 months out of the year. They're burnt out. And it's like,
pun intended.
I think the incentive structure needs to be talked about and worked on, which is why I think it's also worth continuing to have and expanding the discussion, especially around like, what should CAL FIRE within this context be running for California around prescribed burning? And how do you go ahead and empower people outside of that traditional fire infrastructure to potentially take on some of this stuff?
Right.
And I think there's, Lenia Quinn Davidson is a well-known person within this world. She's academic. She's quite nice and spent a lot of time talking to me about all this. And I think is asking a lot of, she's asking a lot of questions about this kind of stuff. And I think those questions remain, especially for Indigenous fire practitioners. I think that the role of CAL FIRE or the role of the U.S. Forest Service, if it comes down to them standing in the way, I think you have a lot of very frustrated people on the ground that maybe aren't part of those traditional structures, but still want to get this done. And I don't think you're going to get it done without all the groups involved. And so how do you empower some of those groups too safely? How do you back them up with liability? How do you go ahead and do all that? I don't have answers for any of that. Like we talk about it a lot in the show, but it seems to be something that's getting worked out right now.
It does seem to be like decentralizing some of those decision structures is important, right? And it's, So
I have no idea.
Yeah, no. I'm not suggesting you do.
Pay grade,
So I did want to ask you about the nuance. You mentioned it was the easiest one to do, the episode where you talked about prescribed fire and good fire and cultural fire. But I wanted to, you did such a really good job of explaining and giving examples for the nuance and the amount of detail that goes into planning something like that, and the amount of knowledge and experience that goes into applying good fire on the landscape. I wanted to ask, why did you feel it was important to go that in depth and that detail into how to do? I feel like it was the one thing that you specifically went into specific detail and gave specific examples of how difficult this is to do.
I know this might blow the minds of everybody in the fire community who's been doing prescribed burning since they were babies, but the vast majority of the public, myself included, have no idea as to what goes into it.
Yeah.
As far as I knew, I mean, I knew this wasn't the case, but generally, I just had no idea what went into it. It's like, do you just go set something on fire when the weather's a certain way? Like, obviously not. And it sounds silly. It might sound silly to a lot of the experts out there, but the general public has no idea. One, they don't know these things happen. And two, when they think about them, they have no idea of any of the nuance. And so you got to cover some of that nuance so people understand the process behind it, which then also I think speaks to the ultimate purpose of it and helps people grasp the ultimate purpose and say, okay, in my mind, I can now, all right, so we want to help the hazel burn straighter, or grow straighter. All right, that's there's an objective there, and we can see that working out pretty well. So I think it's good to go into that kind of stuff, and also recognizing that it's a lot different depending on where you are, what landscape you're on, right? The objectives are different.
Yeah. And
I think that, again, a general audience can take nuance. People want nuance.
Yes.
I don't know. I try not to talk down. I try to just explain it the way that, because I'm not an expert in any of this either yet until I go through all these processes, and I'm learning along with everybody else. And I want people to feel the same moments of revelation that I have had throughout this whole process.
And I think that was evident, right? It was very evident that you wanted to do this in the right way. And it was also very evident that you came from a place of ignorance but also ended up in a place of knowledge where, you explained things in a way that, I've had, I don't know how many conversations about fire and prescribed burning, probably 20, that I've recorded, but I've never talked about the specifics of, relative humidity and
yeah, but that's also a storytelling technique. That's
right.
like, don't you want to know some of those details? I love details like that.
Right.
You know?
And my mind's always further up in the sky. And I need to be thinking about, okay, how do I pull people in using the detail and the complexity, right? And it was great. And it was the first time I'd heard that in all the fire recordings that I've heard and done myself. So it was refreshing to hear, because it was like, that's what's missing, is the appreciation.
You know, like when you're someone like, you know, Margot Robbins, and you can walk out there and you can like just look at this patch of land, you know, the history, you have all this wonderful context. You know exactly what it should be.
Right.
You know, and you can justify it like 7,000 different ways. You can do all this. Like that, to me, that gets me personally so excited to hear all of those little different pieces of just knowledge that have been built over all this time that I then get access to for that moment. And like, I want to share that with the audience, because again, it helps shape people's view of something. It goes to a place of like, it's an art and a science. And like, to me, that's really cool. Like I just really love that. I tripped out. There were so many details I didn't include that I wanted to include, that the people I work with were like, it's a little heavy on the details. And I'm like, okay. Yeah. I'm like, fair enough, you know? But, yeah.
Oh, it was excellent. Like I have to applaud you with the way, like I said before, that the concept of applying story to science communication is huge. And I think with that series, it just came out so clear and concise. And I think the things that you omitted and the things that you included made it easy to listen to and to follow along, which is, I think, a lot of times where I struggle, because I'm trying to weave these things together and I forget what other people don't know. Right. And so I think it's important to do those, to tie those things together very concisely and slowly. Right. And it was great.
What I'll say to anyone that's trying to communicate science is, and I have this too, there is a feeling of needing to kind of prove yourself and your bona fides to other people in the academic field, or when you're talking to scientists or fire folks. And to be honest with you, for us, it makes bad tape. Like for me, like I know this, I read all your publications about this thing. Like I went into every little piece of them. I have it kind of memorized. Like I know all this stuff before I go in and I hang out with a Nate Stevenson out in the forest, right? I'm a fan of his, essentially, by the point I get to talking to him. He's like, you know, an expert in giant sequoias. But that doesn't make good radio. It doesn't make good podcasts. It doesn't make good story, because you need to have that moment of discovery. And they're genuine moments of discovery, but I've done my background research. But if you can go ahead and you're talking to a normal person and you just want them to like really grasp what you're talking about, you know, it's okay to be a little ignorant about it and to really kind of break it down to basics in a way that just realize that, like, and I don't think that, you know, I don't know if this is the case with you, but with a lot of science people or a lot of people in these worlds, like a lot of this stuff is really cool. It's really cool. And so like taking a moment to appreciate how cool it is also, and like convey that through the story you're telling, like it's my favorite part of the job. Although I do also like talking academic with people. That is fun sometimes, but it doesn't make good radio. It doesn't make good podcast.
For sure. Absolutely. No, and I think I definitely have that issue. I think there's always that in the back of your mind, like, all right, people are listening to me talk right now. How do I sound like I know what I'm talking about? And yeah, you're right. I think that's a good point, right?
Pay attention to the things that excite you, though. That's what you need to do, is pay attention to that thing that, like, you know, you've seen it 7,000 times, so you're like, oh yeah, it happened again. And like, that is your little moment of like, the audience will feel that too. Yeah. For sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I felt that, and I enjoyed that. And even though I understood and knew most of the things you were talking about, it was nice to, it was like I was learning it for the first time. It was great. It was very, very cool. Awesome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you felt that way. Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to dive back into public perception again. It's a good time to ask this question because we're talking about messaging. We're talking about pulling in the public into these ideas and concepts so that they can have good thoughts and, you know, educated thoughts on the subject when they go to vote or when they go to do whatever. What do you see? What are we getting wrong when it comes to the messaging around fire and public perception? You know, like how do you think we can change our society's relationship with fire and kind of start anew? Like it's a big question, but it's
really easy question to answer.
I know.
I don't even know
but
if
I
I
have
did
to
it
ask
over
it.
10 episodes. I think it's so hard. I think it's so hard. I'm just giving you a hard time. I think it's so hard.
All good.
It's so hard.
Mm-hmm.
But believe me, I talked about it a lot. And I thought about it a lot. And I think even introducing basic concepts like good fire is kind of the beginning.
Yeah.
And to me, I mean, hey, if you have any people that work in government that are listening, especially here in the States, like, got to work on your messaging around stuff like prescribed burning. Like, it has to be, like, if we're talking narratives, a fire, and I talked to Stephen Pine a lot about this. Like the fire, it's perfect narrative. It's a perfect like war battle narrative. It's how do you beat that in terms of it being just so compelling, the stakes being super high. It's fascinating. I use it in my storytelling all the time. But the thing that makes like the good fire stuff interesting is it's not that. And you kind of got to find other ways to make, like, either with nuance or whatever, to make it kind of interesting. I think that people don't even know there are other choices out there than the like war narrative. And there's a reason why it works so well. And so figuring out other ways to introduce people to these cool, nuanced things that we can do, ways that we can save ourselves, ways that they are very high stakes. These decisions we're making are very high stakes. Again, you need to introduce stakes and get people to buy in. You know, I think over time you can start to shift the conversation. And I really think I don't know what goes into the government messaging programs. I know some folks who have done them and do a great job, but I think that I generally think that we could probably do a bit better, and I think they would generally agree too. Like Smokey's just negative. Like Smokey Bear is just negative. Smokey Bear is looking good these days, and like, you know, is like is doing its job, but I don't know. Yeah. Maybe there needs to be a good fire Smokey Bear, or maybe Smokey Bear needs to embrace good fire, and we need a cartoon series of Smokey Bear talking about good fire on stuff. I don't know. Like, maybe we can figure out a creative. Give me some IP, everybody, please. Give me a cut.
No, you're right, because it's been this war on fire, right? For the last 70, 80, 100 years, it's been a war on fire. How do we stop fire? Fire's the bad guy, right? How do we? And you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think there needs to be a change in the narrative, and not just in the scientific and decision-making circles, but in the public circles, right? In the public understanding and engaging people in that. And I think that is one of the biggest, like, I know talking to Amy Cardinal Christensen, who was my co-host on the Good Fire show, she always says that, like, she has young daughters that are, I think, 2.5 and 5 or something like that. And she's like, their entire life, their concept of fire has been regenerative, right? And like, yes, but they understand at 5 years old or whatever that, this can be a problem, but it's also like, cause she's burning all the time. Every year she's burning the grass around her home, and she's doing stuff like that. And she's like, it's totally possible to have a different relationship with fire from the beginning. But until we start to actively change that narrative and actively start to,
I will just say, as a member of the general public, how do I know any of this stuff? Right. Like, all of you fire folks that are listening get to do such cool things and have the training and have the gear and have all this stuff. And like, getting to go out and do that Trex, I did went out with Trex on a Trex program. Like, just getting to do that there and observe was mind blowing. And I think that having, I don't even know how you deal with this in terms of liability, but being able to go out on a burn in, like, in Angeles National Forest nearby or something like that, like, it really would shift a lot of, I think it would shift a lot of perspective. Now you have 10 million people in LA County, so it's a lot of trips out to do a burn, but maybe there needs to be more buy-in from local news media as well. Maybe there needs to be more whatever. The problem is, again, doing a burn is not nearly as exciting, I'm sorry, as is a car chase or a fast-moving fire. And so there needs to be creative messaging around it for folks that really want to promote this kind of thing. And I think it does begin with just getting journalists out on burns, is what I would also say. Is like, Or maybe I'm the only journalist. I know I'm not the only journalist. A lot of journalists find it cool, but yeah, it was a good experience.
No, I think you're right. It's just about getting because all the public hears right now is, they see the big flames and they're breathing in the smoke, and that's their relationship to fire. That's all of it. Yeah. So how do you convince them otherwise? But I think it starts with that, right? And I think you're right. There's no messaging.
It's like they say a prescribed burn is going on today. Don't call us because there's smoke in the air.
Right.
It's about all the messaging. Okay, maybe it's an opportunity to do really cool science shit. That would be awesome. Yeah. I don't know, JPL versus JPL. I get messages about the founding, discovering the universe. I can go up to Mount Wilson and do all these tours of this really wonderful stuff that's all about this amazing, the literal discovery of the universe or whatever. And that kind of thing is really cool. It's like a trip out to go do that. And I know Harold Biswell back in the 50s or whatever used to bring people out and do burns in front of them on a small scale. And I think it seemed to have changed minds as he did that. And so I would have loved growing up in California as a California school kid to go out and get to watch a little bit of a bird. That would have been so cool. And it would have changed my perspective on it.
Huge.
Absolutely huge. And you get to do that cool stuff as a school kid, right? You go on trips, but maybe there's a demonstration area they can build. Maybe there's whatever, it doesn't always have to be for, proper scientific, whatever research reasons. Maybe it's just appealing to the public and get kids out there to actually see it. Because when you see it in person, it's so much more powerful than me watching a video.
Absolutely.
It is. It truly is.
Oh yeah, if you get to feel the heat and see the flames and see absolutely, it's an adrenaline rush, and that's what gets people to remember it. And
it doesn't have to be as big of an adrenaline rush as I had out in the middle of the forest. Genuinely, it could be a research plot or a demonstration plot somewhere, and you could grow the grasses that you're going to clear out or whatever. And if you end up doing that and you're in California, please let me know. I would love to see that, and I would love to see the public reaction to that. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that would start to change the way we think about it, right? But this is why I brought you on, right? Was to bring in that perspective of not being in the academia, not being in the work, not being a firefighter, and just learning about this, as an interested member of the public, essentially, right? And so I think this is why these are insights that I think provide a little more context and a little more direction for people that might be listening that maybe are in a place to start doing different messaging around fire, and how do we start changing our society's concepts of fire into something that's more productive and less doom and gloom kind of thing, right?
I think it's so hard. I think you also have to have you have to show what the promise is, right? Which is why the giant sequoia story is so good. The giant sequoia story being that basically, I think it was KNP complex. Basically, as soon as it arrived in giant forest, it kind of laid down. And one of the reasons for that is because it had prescribed fire put on it it's had it for ages.
Yeah.
What was interesting about that, the more I learned about it, is that below the slope, down slope from where giant forest is, was an area that they just never burned. And it burned with such high intensity, it destroyed everything as you'd expect. But understanding, this is in episode 2 if you want to go listen, but again, setting those stakes, understanding what is at stake and what we can do if this sort of thing is implemented, I think is really, really, really important. Because just telling people we need more fire or whatever, I don't want to be breathing smoke. I don't. Yeah. The air quality is bad enough. So now you're going to be burning year round. It's already burning year round.
Yeah.
And so how do you go ahead and show people that on the other side of these flames that we're intentionally setting is promise?
Yes.
And I don't know. I think there's a lot of different storytelling kind of things you could do to approach that, and help get that across.
Yeah. But it's important that we do that. And I think your show is a good way to begin that process, I think, right? And kind of get, I hope it reaches out to millions of people and it all kind of changes their perspective.
I hope so.
Yeah. But I think it was uniquely because of your background that story was told so clearly and concisely, and that because you were trying to answer your own questions, right? And you're coming at it from a place of no real knowledge, and which is why it was so good. So there's this concept that I talk about a lot in the show. We talk about the concept of wilderness, and you explored the concept of wilderness a bit here, right, in the show. Okay. And it's obviously another big one to talk about. You brought up John Muir and the concept of conservation and the concept that, we need to preserve this perfect natural thing. I found it interesting the way you brought it up, right? Was John Muir, his role as a leading, inspiring, the park conservation movement in the States, although he may have saved those places from, commercial enterprise and that sort of thing, they also removed the indigenous people from the area, removed the good fire that was happening in the area, removed any kind of human interaction that was happening prior. And he said, yeah, keep people out of here. People are the problem. Let's move on. But he was blinded by his own culture, right? He's blinded by his own understanding of what reality is, and his own culture and experience kind of blinded him to it. And I wanted to know why you felt the need to create that divide between the colonial mindset of nature and, indigenous mindset of nature. And I wanted to know why you thought that was important to bring into the story.
I would say, one, it inherently interests me, but two, what we've been doing and how we approach our world and landscape management in a lot of ways and how we treat our world is not working.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to climate change and a lot of these bigger problems that we're facing. And the question that I get from a lot of people when it comes to talking about climate change or fires or whatever is like, it's always framed as, how do we adjust to keep things exactly the same way and continue on the same path we've been on? And there comes a point where I don't see a way forward personally with climate change, with these fires, all that kind of stuff, like in the way that we've been going. And so we need to be examining how we think about the world around us. And if you hear any hesitancy in my voice, because I'm still thinking about it a lot, and I don't, I'm trying to process all of it too. And these ideas of, this is kind of outside the scope of this podcast and the conversation, but certain ideas about consumption, growth, like I said, use of land, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And, those are discussions we need to be having.
Absolutely. It's important. I don't think it is outside. I think it's well within, because these are the things that led us to where we are now, right? It's our culture that led us to do the things that we've done. And it's important. I think it's probably one of the hardest things in the world to do, is to take yourself outside of your own culture. Like, taking yourself outside of your own perspective is one thing, right? Outside of, step into someone else's shoes, you can maybe kind of empathize a little bit, but to remove your entire concept of reality is created by your culture, and to try to relate to people that, hey, that's one way of seeing the world. There's many more. And that's the biggest shift, I think. But I think when people are able to make that shift into appreciating and seeing that, there is another way of doing this that can also work, or has worked, or whatever, it allows them to, it opens up the opportunity a lot more, I think, right? It opens up your mind to the potential. And I think, so I think it was a good point to bring up, and that you're just like, hey, by the way, John Muir is a good guy, did some cool stuff, but also there's issues there as well.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't know if I ever said he was a good guy. I don't think he was necessarily but the whole discussion around John Muir and how much time to spend on that period was a big one that we had. Yeah. And at the very least, I think that there are discussions worth having. And I think there are discussions worth having about a lot of this stuff, especially if we're going to talk about, like I mentioned, growth, like I mentioned, what are our motivations pushing us forward? And that is it profit? Is it like what profit you can squeeze from certain pieces of land? Is it like I think that these are part of bigger discussions that we're being forced to have now in part because of climate change, because of certain resource issues, because of the implications of using fossil fuels. And I think that they're worth having, and much smarter people than I have been able to address them in like much clearer ways. And so it's something that I'm thinking a lot about and working through for sure. And, if I do another season of anything, I definitely would like to get into it a bit more, because I think it's part of the conversation that when we talk about climate and these sorts of issues that we oftentimes aren't really having outside of circles of people that like to think about this kind of stuff. And I don't quite know how you bring it to a quote unquote a general audience, or people that just don't have kind of the desire to dive deep. And
sure.
No shade to them. Like, people have shit to do, people have lives they're leading, and people are worried about putting food on the table. Like, the world's a tough place. And I also understand why some people can't live in that headspace. And so this is all stuff that I think about all the time that I would like to figure out how to translate in an interesting kind of story filled way. And we touched on it briefly in the show, but I would love to kind of return to it again and again. Because
absolutely.
It's important. Yeah,
absolutely. No, yeah, you can't have these conversations unless you have food on the table, right? It's not there's priorities in life, and survival is number one. So it's, I think this is actually like a really interesting thing for people within the science comm community too, is like, I had a discussion with this one guy. You're doing this like panel or something. And I asked him, I said, what do you think when it's 115 degrees outside? Because for me, I think about an increased number of those days. I think about a lack of air conditioning for the most vulnerable Americans and everybody else around the world, and like death and all this. Like, I think about all this. I spiral into all the stuff. And I asked him, because I have to admit that's my job as well. But I asked him, like, what do you think when it's 115 degrees? And he's like, that I need to turn on the air conditioning. And I'm like, fair. Like, okay, so how do I make this story appealing to you? And so I think about that guy a lot. Like, I think about that guy a lot, because I think a lot of people are like that and feel that way. Like I said, like, because they have stuff going on. Everyone has stuff. You can't be bothered to know everything about everything. You can't be bothered to learn everything, right? Like, you got to prioritize. And no, absolutely. You're not going to get everybody, but I think you did a good job of bringing most people in anyways.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it is really a tough part of talking about all this stuff, I understand, especially for a lot of the people that live it all the time. And I felt this a lot with talking to, both academics, people in the policy world, with indigenous people that are in all of those worlds that are doing this, have been talking about this forever. Like, you can feel the frustration, like, for sure. And, if that one person figures out how to break through to everyone, I'll be excited to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So I have a couple more questions. Mm-hmm. And this one is one that I haven't touched on at all ever. And I don't know why, but it's an interesting topic that you brought up during the show, about accountability when it comes to fire. Accountability in the context of like utilities, right? Like poorly kept utility lines causing wildfires that burn down communities and people die from it. How do you hold people accountable?
I guess I could speak maybe a little bit to the broader concept. And I think that if we're talking accountability and making people whole and kind of how we treat folks, I think if there's one of the through lines that you can find between the big one, which is about earthquakes, and the big burn, which is about fire, one of the through lines is that I feel like we need to do a better job taking care of people, I think, and that we need to find more empathy for those around us that suffer the most. And so that's my bias. I could approach it from a much different angle, but that's my own personal kind of feeling about the world. And, what's the point if you're making everything worse for everyone? I think you can get in, again, if we're talking about kind of this, it even connects to the concept of wilderness, right? Like what we use the land for and all that sort of stuff. And so you see a lot of people left behind when you report on disaster and you report on climate change, and you can see a lot of the stuff that is going to go wrong and the people that are going to suffer in the future, and you know that they're not going to get taken care of. And a lot of the time for those people, it's a really surprising thing. And it's sad and it's difficult. And I often wonder like what our obligation what the obligation of broader society, the government, whatever, what our obligation is to go ahead and help people. I mean, we don't even have universal healthcare here. So, let me know how that is, because I would like to know personally. But I think it's a question. It's one of those questions that I think a lot of, every society's got to ask itself. And I think within the context of disasters and the worsening world of disasters, you can't not everybody can bootstrap themselves, to a good place. Yep. And I think that it's a very problematic American myth. And I'm sure it's other places too. I only know the context of America, but, just look at the number of people with disabilities that need help in California, that we don't have systems set up to help them in disaster. You have no vans to go get people out. Like they're on their own and they might be completely dependent on machines to survive. I mean, that to me feels extremely callous. And, all this different stuff and all these different scenarios are floating through my mind when I think about that accountability, when I think about all that. Now, let's put a little positive spin on part of it. Maybe like a little positive little nugget is that okay, well, there might be some incentive programs that are in place that people with disabilities can access. Now, you'd have to ask them if that's enough, if it's enough for everyone, the majority, whatever. You're always going to have edge cases, but, I think I inherently default to, I don't want people to suffer.
Yeah. So that was probably part of that was a big reason for you doing this show, right? Creating, like you talked about it in some of the beginnings, you talked about it as being, a survival guide.
Yeah.
To this new paradigm of fire, right? So was that for you? That was kind of where this came from, was the survival guide, so that people can can kind of learn a little bit about it and maybe be more prepared.
Well, gosh, and talking all this out in this wonderful therapy session, clearly that I've now turned it into, in talking it out, I mean, we have the very practical survival guide. In the big one, which was the last one about earthquakes, last podcast I did about earthquakes, it was even more practical because earthquakes are something that like we rarely ever experience on a large scale here. With fires, it was, I would say, the practicality. We have a couple of very practical episodes that are about prepping or whatever, but a lot of this, the survival guide in like the news you can use kind of aspect of it, a lot of it is, especially for fire, because we're all living through it so much, is like how to even begin processing it all. And I think that's what probably the through line through a lot of the episodes is just like how you fucking process these scary things that are bigger than you, that are getting worse, that feel bad. Like, how do you find the little nugget of hope, the little nugget of like some sort of promise, light at the end of the tunnel? Yeah. And that's what a lot of the journey was also about. And I found it in some places and didn't in others, and like most of life. Yeah.
Yeah. I found myself asking the question about doom and gloom versus hope when I was, and you happened to address it in the last episode. But I do find there's always hope, right? And I think it's important to point out the doom and gloom as well and then, educate and then show, okay, but there's this. I wanted to know for you, and it doesn't have to be necessarily hopeful. It can be whatever comes to mind, but what was the most impactful moment for you during this whole investigation?
I mean, I'll have to default. The moment I would have to default to is talking to my son about the way the world is and the way he sees it. And that comes at the end of the series. And truly, like, unprompted, I've never heard him give that answer that he gives at the end before. Right. And that was quite heavy and profound and like enlightening. And if I'm not biased towards my kid, if I'm going to put my biases towards my kid aside, I would say that, going out on the fire, the prescribed burn was a pretty profound moment, as well as, and so was doing the interviews for the first episode. People shared a lot of really heavy and intense stuff, and I feel honored to have gotten to tell their stories. And it was a lot for a lot of people, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny that you say that about your son too. I actually just listened to the last episode today because it only came out last week, and it's fresh in my mind. At the very end where you're kind of chatting to your 4-year-old son, right?
Yeah.
And about his ideas around this stuff. And why was it important to you to include your son's messaging in there and his personal thoughts around this? But, he's a 4-year-old. He's thinking about, he's just curious, right? And what was the point in including his dialogue in there?
I mean, the final episode's it is straight up a therapy episode. I literally talked to a therapist. So
okay.
It couldn't be any more on the nose, right? But the initial, how I chose to talk to him was before we even knew that I was talking to a therapist, I just took him outside and I sat down with him. And, we just talked about fire. We talked about the stuff he thinks about. This is stuff he's asking me all the time. I just don't usually have him in front of a microphone.
Right.
And so for people that haven't heard it, he asks me a lot about, he asked me about asteroids destroying the dinosaurs. He asked me about, he just asked me about a lot of big questions. And I think it kind of happens as you get older, you start to observe the world around you and whatever, you have big questions about it. But he's been like that since he was a baby. Truly, he's been very articulate since a very young age and has had both worries and makes really intense observations. And so, from a practical standpoint, I knew it would lend itself to some sort of story. It's also highly personal. And from a desire to help people standpoint or help people relate standpoint, I think a lot of parents go through that. And it's hard to avoid fires, as you will hear. I don't bring this stuff up with him. He brings up fires because we hear fire trucks or we see smoke clouds. That's why he brings it up, and you got to explain it. And that interview with that therapist for me has informed a lot of how I've decided to start to approach stuff with him and how to get him to kind of, if he's having a tantrum about something, how to calm down or how to talk to him about heavy stuff. And I'm sure you think of, you have a 2-year-old, right? Does your 2-year-old ask you about the meaning of life yet?
Yeah. Yeah. She's 3 and she's, of course, constant questions, right? Constant questions. Meaning of life hasn't happened yet, but it's constant questions, constant. And you mentioned in the show, you mentioned okay, you're going to be truthful. You're going to tell them what you can, but you also don't want to terrify them or have them, so you have this, you have to be truthful and inspire the intrigue and and inspire them to keep asking more questions and to be interested. But you also don't want to traumatize them. So it's challenging.
But when you're inhaling smoke, when there's big smoke clouds, for instance, people that would know, there's a place called Santa Clarita and it's straight out my window. And in Santa Clarita, there's a place called, what is it? It's it doesn't matter to literally anyone that's listening to this, but there's a canyon that always catches on fire straight out this window that's behind you on my screen right now.
Okay.
And we see that from our house. Right. And also we're in the flight path of fire helicopters and fire planes that take off. And so it's a constant in our lives during fire season. And so you can't hide it from them and you got to be honest. And what I will say is that starting to frame things as good fire in a lot of ways, I don't think we included this. I think we ended up cutting it, but he asked me oh, is that a good fire? Oh, is that that? And that's wonderful because if he can go ahead and he can turn it into something where oh, there is a positive spin on this. I'm not just going to be afraid. Even if I'm breathing a little bit of smoke, I know, hey, there's a positive part of it. I think that little bit of hope for him to hold on to is also really important. And for me and for my wife and all that stuff. In the meantime, we'll protect him. We'll have the air purifiers and all that kind of stuff, obviously. But the framing helps. A lot of life is about framing, I guess. Yeah. Really. Whether you want them to, they're going to notice all this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the way that my wife and I think about it is how do we give them the tools? How do we help them process it? And how do we give them the tools for them to process and feel safe on their own? And
exactly.
We talk about that constantly. And sometimes we screw up and sometimes and a lot of time, hopefully we get it right. And
yeah. But I think it was a great way to end the season. And I thought, I felt like it was It was both hopeful, but also just kind of a breath of fresh air, kind of being like, oh, right, you can think about things in very simple ways, like the way your son did at the end of that show. And people will have to listen to hear what he said. But it was interesting, and it was a great way to end it, in that we don't have to be so serious all the time. Sometimes we can just think simply about things.
I mean, I also think the episode's a lot about, like, a lot of us are just, it's okay to be worried. It's okay if you take a second and you realize that you're feeling overwhelmed by a lot of the stuff, And that's why we did the breathing with her in the episode. It's a little cheesy, and we said it's a little cheesy, but I was like, I actually liked it, and I enjoyed doing it during the conversation. And we did like a little, classic therapy breathing, like meditative breathing, and it helped. And that basic stuff helps. And what I will say to everybody, what I would like, if I could end on something generally right now, like I would say that, like, for everyone that lives in this space all the time, just as I do, like, it is a lot to live with constantly. And it's a lot to think about these big, scary things all the time. And it is worth taking a second and taking a step back and really just appreciating, like, maybe it's the work that you've done, it's a family you have, something like that. Maybe it's just a walk in the woods. Everyone should be kind to themselves and gentle. It's like, it's tough. A lot of this stuff is really tough, is how I really feel about it.
Yeah. It was great. It was great. And I think you did a good job of explaining and going through all of your emotions throughout it. I felt very much like I was in your mind through a lot of it, and that.
I'm sorry.
No, in a good way. In a good way. Because it felt like I was going with you on this journey, on this experience, on this emotional roller coaster of learning. And it was great. It was just really, really good. And I really encourage anybody listening to go and check out The Big Burn. It's really, really, really entertaining. Very
Thank you so much.
Insightful. And I really appreciated you taking the time to come on here today and talk to me, because I think we were able to talk about some stuff that you weren't able to get into in the show, like the science communication stuff. And I appreciate it. It was really good. I learned a bunch today. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And if anybody out there loves to communicate science and has questions or anything, I'm always happy. After the earthquake podcast, we ended up talking to, like I said, a lot of government people and whatnot about communicating around this kind of stuff. And so if I could offer insight to anyone for my like journalistic side, I'm always happy to do that. People can reach out. My email and everything, I think, is on my Twitter, which is just Jacob Margolis. So
there you go.
Always happy to help science folks any way I can. Yeah, and you know what? I also really just appreciate your kind words about the show. So thank you. And I hope other people, if people are feeling overwhelmed by some of this stuff too, is kind of one of my big hopes for this, is that they also can kind of come to a place of maybe even starting to process their own thoughts and feelings about it. And it's a lot of feeling.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I feel like Jacob did such a great job, as I said several times, but I really appreciated his ability to step into his own emotions and his own feelings around this. And I think it makes it real, right? It makes it, you're more able to see where someone's coming from and maybe step into their shoes a little bit more when someone explains it vulnerably the way Jacob has, right? And of course the people that shared their stories on his show are, a lot of the reason for him being able to do that, I'm sure. And yeah, it was a great conversation. Thank you, Jacob, for your time and for such a great show. I really want everyone out there to go out and check out The Big Burn. Excellent show. They're like 30-minute episodes, I think. So good. Thanks a lot. Catch you next year. Take it easy.